everyone, welcome back to Deep Dive. This is episode number 5, and today I'd like to talk to you about two-note phrases. Two-note phrases are the smallest building blocks in music making. After that initial first sound, which could be anything that appears out of the silence, you have the second note that comes after it, that gives it character, that gives it tension and release, and suddenly we find ourselves telling a story through music that we're about to make. So there are many different kinds of two-note phrases, but to simplify, I'd like to really talk about two very contrasting kinds of two-note phrases. One that leans in the beginning of the two, so 1, 2, and then the other phrase is the other way around. 1, 2, the one that goes and leans on the second notes. I think these very small building blocks will help you create a much more interesting and longer phrases in your music making, because it really comes down to that tension and release between two notes that create a larger whole. So hope you find this journey interesting. Let's go. So first, let's look at two-note phrases where you lean on the first note and then disappear with the second note. This usually happens at the end of phrases and end of pieces where there is a resolution happening or cadential finish. So is a good example. There is a dominant chord, and we call this the conflict because we're not home yet, and then is where we want to end up. So this is a two-note phrase, 1, 2. And we want to lean on the first because by leaning on it, we are creating the tension, and by releasing, we are giving that resolution. For example, in Chopin's Andante Spianato, we have this. And then is a resolution. You might be thinking, hold on, there are more than two notes there, but it's actually 1, 2 is what I'm thinking of instead of 1. These middle guys are simply ornamental. So feel. So I'm really thinking of it in two-note phrases with the two little ornamental figures in between. I guess more simple example would be the end of Grieg's Nocturnes. This is as simple as it gets because it's really the same note for the two-note phrase. So even though it's both E, they're serving different function. The first one is part of a different chord that gives it tension, and then really hang on to it. Heavy arms, feel the tension, and then somewhere in between, you're ready to go home. C major chord, and then that very gentle attack of the keys. Moving into the keys, lighter weight, and simply caressing and going in diagonally like we explored in softer dynamics. So this kind of two-note phrases could appear cadentially, like you just saw, or it could be ornamental. So in Bach and Scarlatti repertoire, there is an ornamental practice where instead of going to the note that is written, you sort of ornament around that note, and you have this. So instead of you lean the note just adjacent to the note that Bach wrote. So instead of this one, we go one up, and we lean here. Pa. Instead of just this here. This is a bit like a two-note phrase, even though there are notes in between. So the important thing is to not slam on the last note. It's an exit. Think of the shape that is tapering. Pa. And really prepare to let the weight of your arm disappear as you're right after playing the first note. Right here. So before you play the second note, so you're not playing the two notes down, down, but the second one always is on the upward movement. In the same way, Tchaikovsky sings his second melody in the piano concerto with lots of two-note phrases. So this is a two-note phrase, pa. You don't want never kick the end of the phrase. Which is, there's dissonance here, so feel that delicious dissonance that resolves. It's really feeling that tension and release in these two-note phrases that's most important. So now let's talk about the other kind of two-note phrase where the emphasis is on the second note, not the first. In the very beginning of Robert Schumann's Carnival, we have this. This phrase is really full of two-note phrases that go to the second one. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. It's always going to the second notes. And usually this kind of two-note phrase is existing in the very beginning of the piece when you have a big downbeat, and the downbeat is usually on the second of the two notes, and then the one right before that is to accentuate and give you that energy so you can land on the second note with more energy. So it's almost like this is a up, and then the second one is a down movement. So when you're practicing these, or when you see these in music, make sure that you know how to make a larger sound with the second of the two notes. So if you play the first one too loud, then you have nowhere to go for the second one. So it's always 1, 2. So gather that energy while you're playing the first chord, so you can really grab onto the second one and go on with the piece. Another example of two-note phrase where we need to travel to the second of the two notes as our final destination is the second theme from Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto. This first is a two-note phrase, Tayam, 1, 2, and we must have that two travel, so we can go ta ya da da dum. I always felt this was unfair for the pianist because the string players really sing it so sweetly before the piano entrance, and then pianists have to come in and really mimic that vibrato and warmth of a string instrument. And I always felt no matter what I did, it ended up sounding pom pom instead of ta-dam, two-note phrase that is really connected. And in order to do that, I felt it was really important for me to have this image of a cherry stem stemming from the same point, but simply dividing into two set of cherries. The cherries being my two notes, it has the same origin, and just having that image of its starting point be connected at its root really helped me shape this. It's sort of like pa-dum, it's sort of growing that way, and maybe the second one being a slightly smaller, a bigger fruit. And to make this two-note phrase work, I literally move my body toward the second note. I'm leading on the right side of my body and really singing with that pinky. As always, you have to voice your fingers as long as it is a warm sound, not spiky. So this kind of two-note phrase is totally different in character, and it's important to always think of it traveling to the second one without the second notes having that accent, which is really tricky to do, because as soon as you play the second one louder than the first, because the first note is dying down because of the nature of the instrument, it's really hard for that first note to lean into the second and give that illusion to the audience that the first note is growing ta-yam. And in order to do that, you have to really imagine it in your mind and do everything in your power and your mind to really travel physically toward that second note and really lean when you get to your destination. Before I go, I wanted to revisit those pieces that are really built on two-note phrases as the heart of its piece. And so I have printed these out for you, the examples that came to mind. The first is Schumann's Piano Trio number 2, has a movement that has in the right hand two-note phrase. That's really the heart of the melody. Going back to our first way of playing the two-note phrase, leaning on the first and letting go with the second. This was really known as the Clara theme because she came up with this sort of descending scale theme that Clara and Robert explored to no end. And later, Brahms came in and quoted this falling of the intervals in order to signify its dedication or its inspiration to Clara Schumann. So instead of, as a player, almost envisioned, it's almost like it's saying Clara. So there's that sigh that comes with the two-note phrase here that I think is so beautiful. In similar way, in the 4th Brahms Symphony, one of the greatest melodies, and I hate to play it on the piano because it's so much better when the orchestra does it, but so two-note phrase, there's so much going on in these two-note phrases, and of course following the circle of fifth, it just makes my and heart go crazy every time I hear it. So some of these works, I think, really make use of that two-note phrase as something so expressive and so beautiful. And I hope next time you hear music that you have encountered for the first time, or the piece you've heard 1,000 times, you really notice these little cells, these little two-note phrases that make the composition work. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week.